Shoshone Nation. Our events are made possible with support from the Sugar House Review, the Logan Library, the USU English Department, and community volunteers. I think we're also supposed to thank Cafe Itis for keeping us caffeinated. It's decaf tonight.
It's decaffeinated.
Thank you for keeping us decaffeinated. I always appreciate that. I like to go to bed at a reasonable hour. So tonight we have Charles Waugh. He's going to read for us. When I first met Charles Waugh, I was an undergrad in my last semester of college. I was taking his advanced fiction workshop class. And to be frank with you, I was pretty checked out. I was kind of ready to just be done and move on to what I assumed would be bigger and better things. So I turned in a story to him. I was pretty proud of it, and I was also hoping that it would not require a ton of revision, especially not for the class. And when I got his comments back, he had circled every single one of the verbs on a series of about 3 pages in a row. And had given me comments talking about, coloring up my prose, and also beyond that, thinking about, how these verbs were working in service of dialogue and character development, and what the language was doing for all these individual characters. So when I realized that I would have to actually do some work in my last semester, I was really grateful. It was some of the best feedback I got throughout my entire undergrad career, and that level of attention to detail was something I was really excited to deal with again and to work with you again when I came back to Logan for grad school. Now I have a prepared list of things for Charles. So when he is not mentoring and teaching students at USU, Charles has lived in Vietnam multiple times since he first went to the country in 1996 as a Global Graduates Fellow, including in 2004 through 2005 on a Fulbright Fellowship to teach at Vietnam National University. He's the co-translator of 3 books of Vietnamese fiction and the associate editor for fiction at ISLE, the Journal of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. And he brings that same attention to detail and that care for writers' work that he provided to me for the last 3 or 4 years now, to his most recent project, The Termite Queen, a translation of a novel by a Vietnamese writer, Ta Duy An. Close. The book speaks for itself, so please join me in welcoming Charles Waugh.
Just grab it and do this.
Do that. How's that? Can't tell anything's on. Yeah? Thanks, Keegan. I appreciate that. Yes, I'm known to circle verbs. Thank you guys all for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to talk about this project. I'm excited to read about this, read from this book. It's definitely the weirdest book I've ever worked on. It's got a lot of the weirdest stuff I've ever read in any book ever. Robot dog sex scene. It's a really important work as well, and I think that's the thing that makes me most excited about it. The writer, Ta Duy An, is now retired. He's had a long career. He's part of the Vietnam Writers Union, which means that he's a party member, which means that the Writers Union is an entity of the state in its own way. But it's this weird thing, back in the 40s and 50s and the 60s and during the war, what the Writers Union did was it helped keep the focus of literature on the greater social good. And so what that meant during the war with the United States, for example, was writing stories that would motivate people to continue to fight against the United States and so on. And it also kind of pushes a sort of a kind of way of being it. The idea that literature is supposed to instruct is still very much a big part of that, and that's kind of what this idea of social realism is, where literature is a function of society, and of course when the government controls publishing, that means then that they get to decide what kinds of things they want society to think about and believe in. Now that's all good up until this moment in which Vietnam turns to a capitalist system, free market economy, and then everything kind of falls apart because all of the things that. Thanks for coming, Amber.
Yeah, of course.
All the things that that they've been trying to get people to think about now are not necessarily as important. Everybody's trying to sell something. Everybody's trying to get ahead. Everybody's using every angle they possibly can to make a buck. Yeah, it makes sense in a kind of way. And especially at the beginning, when people are really poor, it kind of makes sense. But now what's happening in Vietnam is this kind of weird thing that people are calling hyper-capitalism. It's not unlike what's happening in other places. It's like here in the US too. The income disparity between the richest and the poorest people is just getting enormous. And especially at the beginning, when right when they first embraced the free market, people who had connections were the people who made all the money. And that makes a lot of sense, right? That the people who ran the state-run enterprises, like the steel industry or the concrete industry or whatever it is, those people had the first line on getting into deals that would make them a lot of money, right? And this book is a lot about that. But the case is now that with this hyper-capitalist society, everybody's trying to make a buck, but the writers' union is now the one holding tapping the brakes, saying, well, what happens when we have these sacred places? Like what happens when my village has this sacred tree that everybody has always, felt, so good underneath and has meant something to me culturally and whatever. But now somebody wants to pave it over or build a, golf course or a development or whatever. This is happening at massive scale there. And so, the writers' union has been the most vocal about trying to have the main goals of society, not just to be about making money, but to live a good life, and to protect the environment, and to have all these things that are outside of that sort of capitalist endeavor. So it has made for what I think is interesting, which is that you have this basically a state entity, the Vietnamese Writers Union, opposing this other part of what everybody else is doing. And so it's like this official thing, but it's also not what everybody else is doing. So it's put them in this uncomfortable position. This particular writer, Ta Duy Anh, has written several novels that have been banned for various reasons. This one was published in 2017 and then banned in 2018. And as I was talking to Ashley earlier before we got started tonight, what that meant was as soon as they banned it, they took all the copies out of the bookstores. So you can't really get that edition of the book anymore. But Ta Duy Anh wanted that book to still be available, and so what he did was he sent a PDF of it to a publisher in the US, and there's a lot of Vietnamese in the diaspora, overseas Vietnamese, who, they were allies of the US during the war, and now they live in France and the US and Germany and all over the world. But, they like to see when the government in Hanoi makes mistakes, and they like to point that out. And so if the government in Hanoi has decided to ban a book, they want to read it. And that's great for selling books. The book sold out on pre-orders, and I had a conversation with Keegan about this before. Occasionally if you're looking at Amazon and it says it's not available, it's because we can just barely keep up with the number of orders. They're doing these small batches with the press, so Amazon gets so many of them, and then they sell them, and then it's another whatever. So if you're interested in the book, the best way to buy it is from me tonight. It's back there. You get a little discount, but if you sell through all of these and you're still looking for one, just wait, because the printer will send more to Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, but it might take a little while. So this book is complicated in that it's about land policy in a way, and so in order to understand that, I just need to explain a couple things. Vietnam's still, even though it's embraced the free market economy, is a communist country, and that means that land ownership is not private. It's all land is owned by the state. So if you want to live on a piece of land and farm it or use it in whatever way, you can get these long-term leases on it. It's not unlike if you've ever heard about people who have cabins up the canyon, for example. Forest Service owns the land, but the person who owns the cabin owns the cabin. But when the lease is up, they can renew, or then they'll have to sell, right? So they don't really own the land, they just kind of are renting it, and they might own the thing that's on it. It's kind of like that in Vietnam as well. For the most part, most of that land is owned by farmers, and there's been a whole series of different processes in which land has been redistributed at various times, both pre-colonial times, colonial times. When the Vietnamese Communist Party took over, they had a big land redistribution. It happens quite frequently, but what has happened most in that one, the one the Vietnamese Communist Party took over and they redistributed that land, that meant mostly that it was giving that land in long-term leases to farmers to grow food on. And that was fine all the way up until that moment again when they embraced the free market economy, and then someone suddenly said, hey, what about instead of that rice field over there, we put a big hotel with a golf course or a big beach resort, you know? Then it gets tricky, right? Because they can't, you can't force a farmer to give up their land, but you can force a farmer to give up their land. And this book is a lot about that pressure to force people to sell to these big development companies. I'll soon get to the reading part of it, but the main things that you need to know is that it's being told by this narrator named Viet, which is a really common name. Maybe you've heard of the now famous writer here in the US, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who wrote The Sympathizer, which got a lot of attention recently, and the follow-up books for that. So Viet, very common name. It just so happens that his last name is Nam. So Vietnam. So Viet, his father runs this development company, and when his father dies, he comes back from his education abroad and takes over the company, which he's a major shareholder in. And then he learns how the business is actually done. A lot of it's not what he thinks it is, and he does. So what's really brilliant about this is that as he's learning how it all works, we also learn how it all works, right? So it makes a lot of sense that he's learning these things, and we get to have them revealed as he starts to understand them. But the mystery that animates most of the book is this search for Mr. Big, who is this nebulous background character who nobody knows who he is, but he's the one who has the connection between the venture capitalist developers and the wheels of power in the Vietnamese government. So he somehow is this way. As soon as you've got him on your side, everything works out okay, right? So that's who he's looking for most of the book. And along the way, of course, he falls in love, and there's a girl, and it's great. It doesn't work out. I shouldn't say that. Exactly how you think it will. But there's all sorts of other parts of that too. And so I think with that, I think maybe now I can get to actually tell you some of the story. With no literary talent, I never aspired to become a writer, and always assumed I'd follow my father's advice to study finance. As the son of a rich and famous businessman, I could study at any of the world's best universities, but as it was, literature determined the country where I would go to school. During senior year of high school, my literature teacher taught so passionlessly, each lecture was deadly dull, but she also told us stories. I've traveled all over the world and have yet to find another storyteller as great as she. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, but she had a mesmerizing face. Whenever I think about the Virgin Mary or a goddess, my teacher's holy face fills my mind. When she told a story, each student in class looked at her beautiful lips attentively, and our hearts leapt. I personally felt a sharp pain somewhere in my tiny blood vessels and assured myself that she must be an angel. No earthly human could have her eyes, her lips, and her clear vibrato voice. When my teacher read to us Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, I dreamed about the day when I could visit England. Bronte herself is also an angel to me, as is her sister, Emily. I have somehow been hypnotized by their writing. When my father gave me a list of the schools he approved of where I might study, I didn't make the connection explicitly at the time, but only felt strong winds blowing me toward the moors of northern England, as depicted in Wuthering Heights. I say this simply to try to articulate my strange relationship with literature. I discovered I had been fated to become a writer, albeit reluctantly, after I finished reading a book called The Termite Queen in a single night. Its author lived a reclusive life and rarely appeared in public, preferring instead to keep his anonymity through the use of a pseudonym. But the book challenged my courage and self-control. That night and every moment since my father passed away, my emotions have been in absolute turmoil. Reading the book felt like reliving a painful period, not only in my own life, but also in the lives of those I love. So I'm going to be skipping it around a little bit. So when you read it yourself, you'll get way more. And try to get you to some of the juicy bits. Perhaps it was my old teacher who had told me that since literature first appeared, it has been paying the price for its ability to distort the truth and arouse suspicions. Bear in mind that a totalitarian who can burn Rome in a single night or hang any writer or philosopher on a whim is still absolutely powerless to make people reject a literary work that infuriates him. And I am a nobody, of course. So finally, I decided to set the record straight by rewriting my father's story in my own book, this very book you are about to read. I would not call my narrative a work of literature. Rather, it is an appendix to the original Termite Queen, my attempt to add the additional necessary details and to correct misrepresented information depending on the event or situation. I rewrote the Termite Queen in my own way, based on facts that often only I was privy to. I quoted certain passages from the original verbatim when I could not rewrite them any better, and I cited them properly to avoid confusion. I apologize if the readers of this narrative are sometimes uncomfortable with the two distinct voices presented in my book that work independently of each other because they come from two unrelated narrators. I also chose to name my book The Termite Queen because I wanted to pay respect to the author of the original. At the very least, he took the time to research my father and my family with apparently good intentions, and my book would not exist without his. Please consider my book, The Termite Queen, version 2, or The Real Termite Queen, which intentionally follows The Termite Queen version 1, the original. This is chapter 1. I felt fortunate to be by my father's side at the moment he died. I felt there was something tearing at my father's heart, even as he lay dying. I know of no other world, as people often suggest, than this world. But if there is an afterlife, my father must still be thinking about the burdens he carried with him to his grave. I had always felt I could read most of my father's thoughts. Sometimes, when on his deathbed, he asked to see the photo of my grandparents that usually sat atop our family altar, I nearly asked him what he wished to tell me, but I never did because I kept hoping a miracle would bring him back to this world. His eyes held a secret, something surely related to my mother, my younger sister, and me. But as I said, he took all his secrets with him to the grave. His funeral was regarded in the media as a social event because of all the public attention it received. The shop fronts that faced the main thoroughfare voluntarily closed when my father's hearse passed by. In life, when my father had been magnanimous with everyone, especially on big holidays like the Lunar New Year or any time donations were needed, thousands of people came to the funeral to say farewell, and the lines of people wanting to show their gratitude stretched for kilometers down and around the block. Newspapers wrote captivating headlines about it, as if my father were a celebrity. Politicians and most of the country's extravagantly wealthy business people came. Many of them were his former partners, and others were his rivals. The latter came to say farewell to the man who would no longer stand in their way or scheme to supplant them. Many people remained his good, loyal friends until the day he died. I could tell by looking at their faces. Most of them realized a door had just been shut, and hungry wolves now surrounded them. They projected both sympathy and anger, having all taken the oath to live together, perish together. But what the public wanted most desperately to know was how the regime Mr. Nam, abbreviated to N in the original Termite Queen, had established would survive after his death, and who would inherit his tremendous empire. The media was ravenous for information. I must remember that. When I came to terms with the enormity of the inheritance he had left me, I realized just how extraordinary a man my father had been. I had lived an insulated, almost naive childhood, and thus I had to ask myself, how did he manage such an extremely complicated system so smoothly that it could generate so much money every day? A great amount of money, a stupendous amount of money. Often the situation surprised my father too. Those not from our generation and those who still struggled to eke out a living by saving a penny each day would never be able to imagine how my father could take money from other people so easily. But of course, everyone wished to be in his shoes. I saw that every time I looked into the eyes of his friends, or my friends' parents, or his business partners. They all envied him and despised him in equal measure. After my father passed away, I inherited his role as president and CEO of the company because the majority shareholder stocks he had held were now in my name. Naively, I felt mature enough to accept the position. He had been preparing me for precisely such a moment since I was a college student, so that when the day came, I would not fear to sit in his chair. Even so, I never desired the position, and as it turned out, it proved too much for me to handle. My education took place in a country where transparency reigned. Now I had to get used to acting in ways I detested. Sitting in his chair, I realized he had not been as powerful as he had seemed. The people who actually ran the company always remained in the shadows, and even I did not know who all of them were. Everywhere I turned, I found yet another schemer trying to take over. They would destroy everything my father had built in a single night. My mother didn't have to tell me this. I knew it. These cutthroats were in fact my father's partners, and it was they, I assumed, who caused his death. This assumption made me braver. My father had shed blood, sweat, toil, and tears to make the company prosper, and I would not let it fall into someone else's hands so easily. I decided to take on my father's role despite their resistance. There were also others in the shadows who couldn't care less what I did, because to them I had his title but no power. I swore to myself that I would make anyone who tried to intimidate me or manipulate me pay a hard price. I had inherited my father's genes and surprised many people with my capability to do the job. My father had grown famous for seizing opportunities and seeing potential that no one else did. He had developed countless ways to find out which projects would become gold or diamond mines. The golf course was one such place. 10 years ago, it was just another backwater no one cared about. The people living there didn't have enough food to eat. Only my father and his partners had known that the town had been designated as the site of this future resort development. Of course, he had to spend a lot of money to get this information. Technically, the rural area would be classified as a suburb according to the confidential zoning plans. The zoning map had not even been drawn yet when we began, and it would probably take a long time for the project to become a reality. But eventually, it would be realized. My father had been certain about this, and as an experienced businessman, along with the shadow partner's assistance and advice, of course, would never let such a lucrative opportunity go to anyone else. Only a juggernaut of an operation like his could dare invest. My father recognized there was a certain amount of risk, but he knew how to bide his time. What if the golf course hadn't been approved by all the necessary parties? What if the project proponents were no longer powerful because they died or were forced to step down? What if some busybody changed the zoning plan and there would be no golf course at all? Anything was possible. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. So I'm going to just kind of summarize for you a little bit what happens. So as he learns about this project, he goes and visits the site. He meets some people. He meets some people who are resisting the site. There are people who don't want the project to go forward. There are farmers who are working that land and want to keep working that land. He meets the commune chairman and the district chairman who run those levels of government around that project. So there's a saying, the emperor's will ends at the village gate in Vietnam. And what that means is that, you know, there's all sorts of policies that come from the emperor or what we would think of as a federal government. But when you get to the village, it's the village who decides things. And so local control of things is really important. That's what that saying is really about. So there's approval at high levels for this project, but then there's different degrees of acceptance and rejection of the project at the commune and district level. So he's working with these guys or working against these guys to get the project done. These people become his allies or his antagonists for a while here in the story. He meets a kind of a shady character who claims to be able to know who Mr. Big is and to put him in touch with Mr. Big, and so a lot of the book is dealing with this shady character, going on some wild goose chases to try to find Mr. Big. Another thing he does is he researches the projects that his father worked on in the past, and one of those is a steel factory in a similarly rural area in which there's a lot of resistance to the project, but his father's able to make it work, and his father's able to get the steel factory built. And so he sees this as like a little playbook for himself. He needs to find out exactly what his father did so that he can do the same things to get the golf course project underway in this new place. That leads him to go to the site of the steel factory, and where he meets the man who had been the main leader of the resistance to the steel factory, who eventually capitulated. And once he capitulated, that's pretty much when the steel factory got built. So this next little scene is with him meeting this guy for the first time. He goes to meet this guy to talk to him, you know, in secret about the project and his father and what had happened. Oh, and just to explain this first sentence, he has a lot of missteps along the way. He goes and gives speeches that don't land the way that he hopes they will, and so you'll see what I'm saying after this first sentence here. After the debacle of my failed speech to the farmers, I had run out of ideas and felt exhausted. I decided I'd have to return to the steel factory town to try to learn some new strategies, but this time I would go directly to Bick's home. The house had a bright and airy design with an open floor plan for the living and dining spaces, as well as a small home office right by the windows opening onto the wide front porch where we sat. I pretended to be a scientist doing research on the negative environmental impacts of industrial projects on the countryside. Bick was paralyzed, but his mind was still sharp. Although he used a wheelchair, he didn't look ill. He seemed like he needed someone to talk to. I don't care who you are, Bick said. If you come here, we're friends. Since I've been stuck in this wheelchair, I've just been reading and thinking by myself all the time. I love reading too, I said. May I ask how you were paralyzed? It's a long story, he said with a wry smile. Did it have anything to do with the steel factory? It happened before the factory was built. I'm sorry if my questions make you uncomfortable. It's fine. I just don't want to remember it. I have forgiven them. Who were they? Bick urged me to drink the tea he had poured for us. While I took in the simple furniture in his home, my eyes fell on a stack of papers on the desk just inside the window. He must be writing something, I thought. In England, I was taught that it was impolite to read someone else's personal papers without permission. Therefore, I pretended not to have seen them, but he had noticed. He called a woman's name, and within a few moments, a young woman came from one of the back rooms through the house and stood in the doorway. I was completely stunned by how beautiful she was. She greeted me, and at Bick's request, quickly gathered the pages of the manuscript from the desk and put them into a drawer. I was holding my cup of tea, but my mind followed the woman even after she disappeared again into the back room. My daughter, Zio, Bick said. I'm alive only because of her. My wife gave birth to her when we were no longer young. I wanted her to become a teacher. In her second year at university, she changed her major from education to law. Now she's a senior and will graduate very soon. Before I became paralyzed, and before my wife died, my daughter had been so innocent and so happy. Now, as you can see, she always looks concerned and pensive. I worry for her. Because of me, she's not given a single thought to getting married. My heart suddenly beat faster, but I forced myself to remember why I was there. All parents worry for their children, I said. My mother's no exception. True, said Bick, but my daughter grew up in an unusual situation. Anyway, let me change the subject. Why did you choose me to ask about the steel factory? Might we have met before? I don't think so, I said. Do you? Well, I'm not sure. I can't remember anything these days, but you seem familiar. Interesting. Sometimes I have the same feeling. I meet a complete stranger, but I feel I know them already. Exactly. A gentle noise caught my attention. My eyes met Zio's as she stood in the doorway to one of the back rooms, apparently listening to our conversation. I thought maybe she wanted me to know she was there, but I later realized I'd been wrong. Probably the conversation with Bick was going too far, and she felt an instinctual need to be on alert to protect her father. Naturally, she would want to know the real motivation behind my interviewing him. Bick remained contemplative, as if trying to recall when or where we'd met. I believed many residents of this village would remember the image of my father, but I couldn't be certain what kind of impression he had left. My father and Bick must have met many times. My father had managed to come up with a solution that got the villagers to agree to give up their land, and I needed to know how he'd done it. But I had no idea where to start. Of course, I couldn't reveal my true identity yet. Bick might forgive me, but I doubted Zio would. I didn't know why I was so obsessed with her eyes. She was beautiful and elegant. I could tell just by looking at her that her mind was sharp. Her face made me think of light. Her skin was as pale as fresh snow. Her eyes resembled two copper ponds. Her lips were full. She looked resilient and strong. This woman was the opposite of deception, I thought. Had she switched her major because of the injustices her father and the villagers had suffered? I was surprised when Bick invited me to stay for lunch. On the one hand, I thought I should decline out of respect. On the other, I knew I would regret it if I missed an opportunity, even though I wasn't completely sure what that opportunity was. Was it Zio's bright face and beautiful eyes that made me stay, or did I just want to learn more from Bick? Noticing my hesitation, Bick asked Zio to go to the market and buy some food, already acting on the assumption I would stay, and so making the decision for me. Zio responded to his request enthusiastically. As she prepared to leave for the market, gathering her purse and a vegetable basket, I stood and offered her some money, saying I wanted to help with the meal. But Bick told me, please be our guest, it's just a simple meal. You don't need to pay for anything. Besides, I really feel like I've met you somewhere before. But I'm sure we haven't. I don't know how to explain it, but since you arrived, I felt like I've been transported back to my youth. Thank you for the kind words, even if we don't really know each other that well. I hope everything will be fine. I didn't know what I meant would be fine after saying that. Was it the steel factory, or my relationship with Bick, or my sudden secret infatuation with his daughter? As I looked out at the village lane to conceal my confusing emotions, Bick rolled back and forth across the porch in his wheelchair. He went inside and rearranged the papers in his desk, searching for something, and then put them back in place. When Zio returned from the market, I helped her prepare the food. Bick called my driver up to the porch to drink tea. Zio seemed light and cheerful, but I felt nervous. She talked about her university, picnics, and some of her friends. I told her briefly about the picnics I'd had when I lived in Europe. She seemed not to care much about my having studied abroad, but obviously didn't miss a word I said, especially when I mentioned my ex-girlfriend. With the tray of food on the table before us, Vic no longer looked contemplative, and he became more talkative after a few cups of rice wine. He asked about my job, my family, and my plans for the future. When I mentioned that I had been so busy with school and my new job that I was still single, he responded by playfully chastising Zio for studying too hard and never introducing her boyfriends to him. Zio said nothing, her face revealing nothing. She lost her mother, Vic said. Only she and I live here now. If she had a boyfriend, he could drink rice wine with me. I agree, but I imagine so many men want to date her, you have to chase them away. Zio pouted her lips slightly and placed a fried frog leg in each of our bowls as if to say, eat and leave me alone. Then, as if I had become his confidant, Vic started to tell me the story of the steel factory. If you really want to know everything about that factory, I'll lend you my memoir, but only if you promise not to show it to anyone and will return it to me as soon as you finish. I tried to suppress the complicated emotions rising in me. I wanted to know what he'd written, but I was afraid to confront the truth. I hoped my father had nothing to do with Vic's paralysis, with the villagers' illnesses and deaths, and with people's awful memories of the factory. How could I have a relationship with Zio if my father had somehow caused these tragedies and she knew who I really was? Vic asked Zio to retrieve the manuscript. He handed it to me and said, "Please be careful with it. I still need to revise and edit before it can be published, but the changes will be minor. In general, the events are as written there. Do you think you could find me an experienced editor from the Writers Association?" As I received the memoir from him, my hands trembled. I looked at Vic and asked, "Who did you write this memoir for and why? Take it home and read it, and you'll find out. Just don't forget to return it." When I said goodbye, I bowed to him as respectfully as a son bowing to his father-in-law. Zio saw and turned away. I couldn't tell whether she was pouting or smiling. Maybe neither. Zio walked me out to the lane. We said goodbye to each other, and I signaled to my driver to start the engine, but then turned back to the gate. "Did you forget something?" she asked. "I want to ask one more question. I hope you'll answer me honestly." "I will," she said, nodding. "When I come back, will you invite me to have lunch again?" "It was my father who invited you for lunch. But yes, thank you for taking an interest in making him so happy." I was half sad, half elated, without knowing why. I put aside the work that needed my attention and ignored all the urgent phone calls from the district chairman. The whole ride home, I devoured Vic's memoir. I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody. That's very nice. I think, this is such a weird thing. So it's like outside of most of our everyday life. So I'm guessing maybe people have questions about the story or about translation or about Vietnam. I'm happy to entertain those.
Hey Charles, thank you so much. That was great. I'm thinking about what you were talking about, the book being published in 2017, banned in 2018, sent from Vietnam to the U.S. Publisher. And how did you reach it? How did you find it? Like, what was the process of you getting your hands on that book and the translation of it, and working with a co-translator?
Yeah, so it's not just my translation. It is also been translated by Quan Mang Ha, and I typically, when I do translation, I use a partner to help me do that. I think it's better that way. I've done some translations on my own, but I just feel like there's just so much. It's so much more productive to have a partner who can you can just work with the whole time. You can ask questions about, if something doesn't seem right or whatever that is. Mostly what I would do is use sort of a word for word translation and kind of go back and forth between that and the Vietnamese itself and kind of use that as a way to better learn and understand the Vietnamese myself, because my Vietnamese is okay, but it's not great, and I don't read it all the time, and so that's really hard for me. It takes me a long time, so it also speeds everything up. And Quan is born in Dalat, which is a mountain town in the southern half of Vietnam, up in the mountains. He did his undergraduate in Vietnam and then came here for graduate school and then got hired as an assistant professor at the University of Montana and is now a full professor there. So he's also pretty well established in his career at this point. And he's a really great networker. You know, he just is, he's just really great at making connections with people and talking to various people. As a native Vietnamese, he's also really good at making connections there as well. So he reached out to me a number of years ago just asking me advice as his one of his first books was coming out, just some publishing advice, you know, where to go, what to do, whatever. I'm not sure that I was all that helpful to him, but it was nice that he reached out to me and we kind of just started a collegial friendship at that point. And then it was, maybe it was during the pandemic, I think, where he reached out to me and said, hey, I'd like to do a project with you. You know, what are you interested in doing? And so I talked to him about some ideas that I had, and we kind of worked through some stuff, and he was looking for things, and he'd find something and say, what about this? And I'd read some of it and read some synopsis, and you know, we'd kind of go back and forth. We went through maybe 2 or 3 different novels that just for whatever reason did not seem to work out right. And then he found this and he's like, well, it's not exactly what we were looking for, but take a look at this. And the fact that it was banned was really appealing to me. And also the fact that it was so directly about the environment was a real appeal to me. As Keegan mentioned, I'm an associate editor for fiction at ISLE, which is an eco-criticism journal. So the fiction that gets submitted there is comes to me, and I get to decide whether that's something we're going to publish or not, which is super fun. So I'm really interested in environmental lit to begin with. This story does something that is really amazing to me, which is that we've seen a little bit of it here and there in what I've read, but not much. It is really a book about masculinity in so many ways. And there's this phrase, toxic masculinity. So if you've never heard that before, it's basically sort of like the worst aspects of masculinity that make things horrible for everyone else. You know, it's like your worst uncle at Thanksgiving, you know, and worse, you know. And this book both has toxins in it, and it has projects that are toxic, and it has people dying from toxic exposure, and it also has the men responsible for it acting in ways that are utterly horrible. And so it captures toxic masculinity in a way that I don't think I've seen any other book do. And when I realized that, I was like, we gotta do this book, you know. So the fact that it had been banned was a part of that as well, you know, in the sense that, you know, that it's criticizing some parts of the Vietnamese government that I think are worth criticizing. There's an essay at the beginning of the book by a historian who's like one of my heroes. I did a master's degree in history before I did my literature and creative writing PhD. And I read his books during my program, you know, so I'm like, this guy, I know this guy, he's amazing. I can't believe he's involved with this project. But it's really great at providing like the real world historical context for all this stuff. You know, the land grabbing stuff that happens here that I talked about a little bit already, that's like very real stuff. And the Vietnamese government had, you know, the essay that's in there gives statistics for this, like the number of those complaints increasing. It got to a point, it got so bad that At one point, the Vietnamese National Assembly had to put a moratorium on all golf course projects in the country, because again, when it's left up to everyone else, it's all these like dispersed decision makers making all these terrible decisions, and lots of people really got screwed out of their livelihoods. A lot of the projects, the first step of it, where they would convince people to give up their family's lease on the land, that was just like step one, and the farmers would be compensated in the tiniest way, and that first group would then, they wouldn't even be the developer, they would sell it to the developer for like 50 or 100 or 1,000,000 times what they had paid for it, right? So there's all this bad stuff happening with people who had legitimate concerns that were bringing these to the Vietnamese government, and and in some ways, the government is upset and they banned it because the book does portray some of those bad actors, and that they don't seem very good. There's a lot of toxic masculinity in them as well. And so, but another way you could look at this is that, well, the Vietnamese government is also kind of like the hero, because they're also the ones who put that ban on, or that moratorium on, the golf course projects. Like, they realized that it was a problem. So they did change the way things worked based on that criticism. So, this is kind of a novel of that moment. And the short view would be, well, he's criticizing, Ta Duyen is criticizing the government, so we have to shut this down. But another way you could read it is, well, eventually the right things happened, and supposedly it's better now than it was before. I'm not sure if I know that that's true or not, but it certainly brought a lot of attention to the issue, and the book brought a lot of attention to the issue. And they're facing this criticism now. I think the book is getting some attention, and so maybe that also can help reform some things. I don't know. That's a really long, rambling answer to your question.
That's great. Thank you.
Anybody else questions? Yeah, Chad.
So here in the United States, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, we have the National Environmental Protection Act, we have some environmental regulation, we have safeguards in place, and we don't always get it right, but it's better than rivers catching on fire, now, better now than it used to be. Where's Vietnam in terms of that?
Yeah, good question. They do have environmental laws, but what they don't have are good enforcement mechanisms. So there may be laws on books, but that they're not enforced, and so then it doesn't seem to matter. A good example of this, and this is something that this is an example. It's not important to the book, but it's a throwaway example in the book. Recently, 5 years ago, who knows, time's gotten warped since the pandemic for me, maybe it was 10 years ago, but there was a Korean steel company came in, put a steel factory, much not dissimilar from the one that's here, and they got the factory up and running, and then they had this process in which they had to like flush their system or something, and they just basically dumped all of the heavy metals, all the arsenic, all the crap that was a part of this process in whatever way, just dumped it into the river. And it was such a huge plume that it went out into the Eastern Sea, and that's what they call the South China Sea for various reasons, killed fish for 1,000 kilometers up and down the coast. I mean, it was the biggest kill-off of marine life in Vietnamese history, right? It was enormous. But of course it was illegal for that to happen, but it still happened, and they probably got fined, but I'm sure that there was not much that happened as a result of that, So I think there's a lot of stuff like that. There's a lot of things that just sort of happen because there's just not enough people going around able to do the investigative work to figure out what happened, because at first, you just see dead fish, you don't know what happened, how do you, and with something as big as that, of course, then they're going to put the resources into it, but as you probably know, like most of that pollution isn't the big, the big headline catching stuff. It's the little stuff that's happening every single day. It's illegal to put, heavy metals into the street gutter, but you go down to where the machine works are, the metalworking shops are in a big city, and it's like, what's that puddle? So I think they're trying. I would just say that, and there are little moments of things to celebrate along the way, but they're still developing too. So I think they're trying to balance those things in the way that they can with the resources they have, and it's not to the level that we would hope, probably. Anybody else have questions? Yeah, Sarah.
What were some of the biggest hurdles or surprises that came up as you're working on this book? I'm curious.
Robot dogs. I mean, is that a thing? Yeah, definitely Googling that, not on my own home laptop.
Your school laptop?
What other options?
To do a public library. You never know what's going on. And part of it is, at the beginning in the introductory essay, there's a claim made that Tazwiang is a realist writer, and I think that goes back to that social realist literature that he writes or has written. And but there's so much in this book that feels like fabulous or satirical, and so I'm trying to wrap my head around what it would mean for this to be a realist piece of literature, but then it having these very fantastic things that happen, and that's just one example of it. And there are canine sex toys, in case anyone was wondering.
No one was.
We all were.
No.
And there are robot dogs, but as far as I know, no one's quite got the mix of those things yet, except for Tazwiang. And you read something like that, and you certainly say to yourself, well, I've never read that in a piece of literature before. That's saying something, right? But so that was a surprise. There's other things that there's other parts of the story that didn't quite land right for me, and so there was kind of a process in which my translation partner and I had discussions about things, and we discussed things with the author, and we kind of came around with solutions for some of those things. But so that but I think that's always the case. That happens with all sorts of translations. But I think once I was able to reframe what I was thinking about in terms of are we supposed to be thinking this as a realist text, and once I was able to sort of set that aside, that really helped. It certainly made it easier to read the entire last several chapters, and I'll leave that for your own amusement and mystery solving later. Alex, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the translation process of how you approach the more intangible aspects of literature, like voice and style and music. Like how do you approach sort of the pressure or weight to try to bring that to life on the page too from the writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my other two books of translations, I felt like a syntactical, a sense of syntactical cohesiveness really mattered to me in a way. So that I was really looking to try to keep the Vietnamese sentence structure as much as I possibly could, but then to make an English sentence that was still beautiful, And with this translation, one of the things that the writer had said to us was, I want you to do whatever you want with this. He said, I want you to make this as good as you possibly can make it in English, and don't worry about that. So he kind of gave us permission to take a little bit more license with that. And by the way, that's not really a big deal because there's lots of translators who feel already that that's their right to do that. You know, there's a big kind of a debate within translation community about how true you have to be to the original at a sentence level, and then there's like a real like ownership from a lot of translators, like this is my version of the story kind of a thing. So there's something interesting to me about that, and I've resisted that for a long time, but I also recognize that it really made the writing experience more enjoyable for me, and I think it makes the reading experience more enjoyable to read one of these maybe than one of the others. They feel different to me. The prose feels different to me between these projects. But that process of translation is really something I really love. I love pretty much all word games. I love crossword puzzles, and that's really what translation is. It's like it's a big word puzzle. You know, how can I fit this in there? How can I make this sound right there? How can I do that? You know, and you know, there's so many other parts of it, like whether you keep a metaphor or a simile the same or not, whether it's something that makes sense to the target audience or it won't. You know, is it something that is going to be so strange that it just really not worth the trouble it's going to cause? Or is it strange to the point where it's going to be like, a reader's going to be like, oh, that, I've never read that before, that's great, you know? So you're kind of constantly walking that line and having to make those decisions all the time, but it's really fun. So it's just after 8, and I think we run till 8:30, and we probably want to have a little open mic, but if there's one more question, I'd take another question. Anybody else want a question? All right, well, thank you guys for your attention, and I really appreciate it. I do have books back there, and like Keegan said, not available from Amazon right now, so this is your way to get them. Giving you my author's discount here. They're $15. I've got Venmo and cash if you guys want to do that. And then I'm going to turn this back over to Keegan to run the open mic. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Got the open mic sign-up sheet if anybody else wants to sign up. Anybody? All right. Well, then first up we have Ronald, Denise, and then Star.
Hi,
Hi,
called Becky. I started here. She passed away after learning the news. I don't know what to say. He's a good friend for many years. Ever since Don and I came home to the apprentice here. Now you both died at age 67. Now you're back together in heaven. But you'll be missed. That much is true. Let it be known. I love you. Now, just a great 12 years working with you. You made a great team. How much is too? We could clean the table. We could be the kids. There's something you're doing. That's what we did. Enjoyed on you. You were the best. You were a great pup for being your cousin. Now, you know it with your mate. You were missed since you were gay.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I have this Wednesday morning writing practice. That's sort of what I do. So these 3 poems were from the last week of December and through this last Wednesday. This first one's called Embrace. In those moments when you feel lost, lonely, unworthy, or small, walk out into the world. Find a place where you have even a glimpse of a small section of horizon. Stand very still and close your eyes. From the inside, feel your feet on the ground. Stretch your awareness upward and sense the crown of your head and the spacious sky above it. Open your eyes gently and let them rest on the horizon. Slowly, slowly turn in one direction, letting your soft eyes follow where the horizon is, or where it would be even if you can't see it. Know that it is there. Breathe tenderly as you turn. Complete the turning, coming back to the place where you began, where the horizon joins itself into a circle. Stand very still. Can you feel how you are held in this great circle all around you, above and beyond you? The world is always out there waiting for you with arms open wide. All you need to do is step inside. Okay. This one is called Amaryllis, and amaryllis are like what get me through the winter. In the dark of this morning, the amaryllis stands serene. 6 rosy trumpet buds, ready, poised. It has been inching its way into the world for weeks now. From its dark, dense bulb, a small green tongue tip emerged, tasting the air, as if to gauge the readiness of the world. The tongue transformed into a noble green nose, tilted upward, drawing in deeper breaths as it reached for greater heights. We've had to turn its pot clockwise daily so it wouldn't dump itself over in its growing desire to meet the light. What voice whispers in those amaryllis ears? Who or what calls it into being? What is the point of it anyway, except to be unabashedly beautiful? To gladden these days in its own unique way, whether anyone notices or not. But for those who do notice, however briefly, what a gift it offers. I watch, poised, ready to receive. And this last one, is from this Wednesday. It's called Hand in Hand. After the savage snow squall of the previous evening, the yard rests peacefully, swaddled in soft white. In the frigid cold, silence gently holds the world in its cupped palms. Inhaling deeply, I am filled with spacious emptiness. Warm breath becomes cold cloud, becomes ice crystals, suspended before me like last night's restless dreams. I watch as they drift and dissolve into misty memories. The back porch chimes call across the yard, its soothing voice extraordinarily clear in the crystalline air. Snow glitters down from black branches. Overhead, the dark hood of night slips down beyond the mountain's shoulders, revealing the bright face of morning. Sorrow does not linger long in these frozen moments. As it takes its turn to leave, I feel its fingers release my hand. Joy slips his warm palm into mine. All around us, the world shines. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Charles, that was great. I can't wait to read the book. As always, I'm reading a short memoir piece from Sean's Front Room Writing Group, and the prompt for this one was tell the story behind your name. I never liked my name. It was a plain, boring name, no middle name, like my 4 brothers got to have. We 5 girls got plain 2-syllable names with a plain last name, Smith. No middle name to make it interesting, like my brothers. Dallin Elroy, Norman Verrill, Kelvin Neely, Joel Devon. Their names, when added to the Smith, sounded 5 lovely syllables, like poem lines, like something lyrical. The girls' names were 3 beats, like a drum. Boom, boom, boom. Mother's name was like a song. Lela, Alida, Neely, Smith. Dad's name was a solid 5 syllables long, like the boys' names. Elroy Walker Smith. All of us kids, boys and girls both, had N in our names, like the N in Mother's maiden name, Neely. But the N's in our names occurred toward the middle. Our youngest sister, Leanne, and our oldest sister, Manon, each had 2 N's. And Manon had actually a more interesting name than the other 4 of us girls. Nobody could remember where Mother found that name for her. Manon always hated the way everyone mispronounced it. Mignon, like a steak. Though none of us knew about filet mignon until long after we left the farm and started going to restaurants in the city. We raised milk cows, not beef cattle. The only beef we could afford was hamburger or a 7-bone pot roast with lots of fat for Sunday dinners. But back to the names. We were the Neely Smiths, descended from Mormon pioneers, our forebears having come across the plains to southern Idaho from New York, having given up their paltry lives in England on the promise of Joseph Smith, that charlatan of saint-making via polygamy and persecution. Here we were in Idaho, with grandfathers on both sides having multiple wives and divvying up their farmland on too many sons, so they were a lot less prosperous than our surnamesake had guaranteed. So, I changed my last name when I got married at 17. That's what women were supposed to do in those days. And presto, my name became 5 syllables long. But I still didn't like my first name, and I still had Smith in the middle, which I didn't like either. My new last name, my husband's, was a boring, sexist name. I refused to own it. If anyone called me Mrs. I can't even stand to quiet. I set them straight in a hurry. That's not me, that's his mother. She, by the way, has a wealth of syllables in her name. Sarah Bell Anderson, 8 syllables. Wow, that's my lucky number. But I sure wasn't lucky to be her daughter-in-law. She was menopausal mean most of the 23 years I was married to her son. My own daughters were afraid of her and made fun of her alternately, saying her name in a derogatory way, making faces at the faces she used to make at us. It was a pretty name. Too bad. After I left Sarah Bell's son and got a divorce, my youngest daughter and I set to work on changing our names. Her older sister had already changed her last name with her first marriage at 17, like me. She would change it a few more times with subsequent marriages, finally settling on her 3rd husband's name. The 4th one such a dud that she cast it off as if it never happened. My youngest daughter and I wanted to have our very own names, not any man's power moniker over us. We thought carefully about names that really fit who we were, who we had become. I was a poet, a hiker, a mountain lover. Water was important in my life. I'd grown up on the Bear River, loved walking along cool mountain streams. I loved the stars, the diamond glitter of the Milky Way, the Big Dipper, the sun. Oh, the sun. My youngest daughter loved the desert. She idolized the explorers who came to southern Utah and Colorado, who lent their vision of sainthood to the landscape in a way that was more romantic than the Joe Smith version, all those boring white robes and English gardens that have no place in the deserts where we live. She thought up a big name to match her desert dreams, but she shortened it somewhat. Her name is beautiful and unique. So is mine. My stars, sun, and cool mountain stream became Ilena, star, sun, cool brook, incorporating all the vowels and scanning 7.5 syllables. But when I published my first poem at age 44, my graduate school poetry mentor and I agreed that I could shorten it to Star, Cool Brook, so it wouldn't take up more space on the page than the poems I write. And you know, I love my name.
All right. I think I was supposed to tell you guys too that you can only take 7 minutes, and if you take more than 7 minutes, we'll politely but firmly clap. So thank you for not taking more than 7 minutes. We have 2 more. We have Ashley and then Alex.
Hi everyone. Hello. Okay, I'm gonna read a couple poems. The first one is about when you meet someone and you kind of feel an immediate connection with them. Not romantic, but just like you really want to be friends with them and know them, and yeah. So it's called To Build a Home. I think I'll build a home inside of your bones and speak only in riddles and codes, for I love the way that your words rouse welcome wonder. If you will allow me, I'll next make my way to the back of your mind and uncover the things that you don't say out loud, for I long to know your subtle truths and bathe in the stream of your subconscious. I'll tuck my toes beneath your lungs and root myself in that relentless reassurance, the incessant in and out of life, for you are so utterly and thoroughly alive. Then I'll explore the wide open fields of your palms and search for fossils and ancient relics, for I want nothing more than to know your history and perhaps to take part in it. And every night I'll lay myself down in my skeletal palace and think how lucky I am, for what a perfect place to roam and what a pleasure to build a home. And then this other one, if I can find it, doesn't have a name, but here it is. Orange is a lovely time for dancing, second only to pink. Show me your loneliness and I will show you performance or delusion or obsession or beauty or promise or prudence or patience or poverty. Even the birds know what the days mean. Tell me you miss something. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be me. Thanks.
Is that high enough for you guys to hear me? Is that okay? All right. I'm not gonna mess with it then. When Sarah and I read last August, Charles read in the open mic portion because since I wore a Save Great Salt Lake shirt, and so he volunteered to read a short fiction piece that he'd written about Great Salt Lake. So tonight, Charles is wearing a black shirt. So I'm going to read a short nonfiction piece that I wrote about black bears. Stretch a little bit, but trying to maintain, the tradition. But this piece was written for the Red Wolf Multi-Species Journal, or Multi-Species Justice Journal at a USU, and so local outlet called "Families Gather in Protest of Families Torn Apart." And it is not a very phone-friendly format, so I apologize if I'm having to thumb around up here. Part 1, Families Gather and Protest, a reverse chronology. April 8, 2023. After angrily shouting at us, a man in a golf cart called the police on my parents, partner, fellow protesters, and me. It was a beautiful day, so sunny that the mountains wavered over the highway in rural Wellsville, Utah, and the snow burnt our nostrils and shins. We were standing on public land outside the entrance to the Helicon West Heritage Center, which was selling tickets for guests to look at captive bred bear cubs in a barn. These babies came from Yellowstone Bear World, an Idaho bear breeder that annually takes weeks-old newborns from their mothers and forces them to endure a barrage of public events, including multi-day cub holding photo ops, hours-long group encounters, and months of bottle feeding interactions. My father held a sign that read, "Yellowstone Bear World tears families apart." My domestic partner and her sister's sign both read, "Baby animals belong with their mothers." A young couple with a baby girl dressed in a bear onesie arrived, and the new mother rocked her infant and said, "I don't think anyone should have the power to break the mother-baby bond." As more families joined at the protest, we decided to split up into two groups on both sides of the venue's entrance. This was when Golf Cart Man sprang out from behind the wheel, shouted his demands that we stay together, and that he was calling the cops because he didn't want us lawfully breaking up into two groups on public land. Makes sense. A grandmother soothed and eventually left with her young granddaughter, who became too frightened at the idea of the police showing up. No officers materialized. April 9th, 2022. Covering the second annual protest at the Helicon West Heritage Center, organized by People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, and the Utah Animal Rights Coalition, UARC, the Herald Journal chose the headline, "Bear Cub Crusade. Protesters return to baby animal days." The headline's featured image was a mother at the protest holding her smiling little boy as he hugged a teddy bear bigger than he was. Behind them and the other protesters, readers could see the Bear River Mountains, where native black bear cubs likely were hopping over the past winter's deadfall to keep up with their mothers. As it should be, these curious bears would learn from and develop alongside their mothers for the next 2 years. April 8th, 2021. While the annual protest will grow exponentially, this first year's gathering carries a humbling, meaningful nostalgia for me. Half the people who held PETA and UARC signs on the side of the highway were my family. Part 2, Families Torn Apart, a Backwards History. By April 8th, 2023. In the years since our 2022 protest, Bear World was cited for violating captive wildlife regulations by Idaho Fish and Game, cited for violating the Federal Animal Welfare Act by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and fined for violating worker safety laws by the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Bear World reacted to getting caught breaking Idaho code by having its lawyers write a bill that virtually exempted itself from state oversight going forward. Governor Little signed the bill into law in March. That same month, this bear breeder shipped off 8 2-month-old black bear cubs to Greg Woody, an exotic animal wholesaler in Illinois with a documented history of sending bears to slaughter. Since 2012, Bear World has sent 97 known black bears to Woody. Bear World then shipped off 2 more cubs to a Hollywood bear wrangler in Bend, Oregon, whose recent credits include making a bear in chains participate in a stunt for the latest Jackass movie. By April 9th, 2022. The Herald Journal article covering our 2022 protest would later include that Bear World, quote, said the bears born at its facility will remain there for life, and that the animals in its care are considered family, end quote. However, Bear World had already sold and shipped 3 cubs to Greg Woody by the end of that March, and it would go on to sell another cub to Woody in a few weeks after making this statement. Prematurely separating babies from their mothers threatens the infant's long-term development. Robbed of the chance to nurse naturally from their mothers, cubs from Bear World have been recorded trying to nurse on staff's chins, arms, and on other bears' ears. And numerous bears have been documented exhibiting signs of psychological distress by pacing and tossing their heads. By April 8th, 2021. For more than 2 decades, Bear World has sent bears off to fill cages of Hollywood wranglers and America's most notorious captive wildlife facilities, including Oswald's Bear Ranch, Kirshner's Wildlife Foundation, and probably most famously, the GW Zoo, made infamous in the Tiger King docuseries. Bear World has become the country's largest known bear supplier, fueling the cruel cub petting industry spring after spring. In March 2021, the facility sent 5 baby bears to Greg Woody. At the beginning of April, it shipped a lone cub across the continent to a New Hampshire tourist trap called Clark's Bears that forces bears to perform in circus-like shows. There, traveling families pay to surround and laugh at bears who do things with scooters, basketballs, and a swing. These shows last 30 minutes. Captive bears can live for more than 30 years. And they'll continue to pace the fence lines along the roadsides of our family trips until we stop buying tickets. Thank you.
All right, guys. Next, Helicon West will be on January 25th. Brock DeChair will be doing a generative writing presentation and prompt. That'll be here?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that will be here on the 25th, 2 weeks from today. What else am I supposed to tell you guys?
Buy Charles' book.
Well, yeah, of course. Obviously, buy my thesis chair's book. If you liked it, definitely buy it. If you didn't like it, buy it anyway, because then you'll be in a good mood. And so that's great. Thanks to Charles. Thanks to Star, who I think we usually call our matron saint here. Is that right? Thank you to all of the open mic readers, and thanks to everybody who came out. Have a great night.
Thank you.